name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Today is the fifth Sunday after Easter, which sort of concludes the Easter cycle, and next Sunday will be Ascension Sunday. Christ ascends, Sophia and Virgin Mary are assumed. That's different words. Anyway, it will be Ascension Sunday, at which time the Paschal candle is extinguished and we are moving into the next season. And on the fifth Sunday there is a particularly sort of lovely and reassuring gospel written by John. And John's gospel is by no means to be disdained. Some of the biblical scholars feel that there have been sort of interpolations even into the Gospel of John because people wanted to make it the most beautiful gospel as against the Gospel of Thomas. That's quite possible. But I don't think that St. John the Divine is to be faulted for that. And there are some very wonderful passages in it, including the one of today, which is attributed to the Lord. And as the admonition is repeated, let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. And it's a great and important admonition, because we, well, I don't need to tell you, we are people whose heart is troubled practically all the time. I don't know about you, mine is, so I have a suspicion that maybe yours is too. That's why all the psychologists and the therapists and the psychoanalysts and the shrinks and all that's why they are all around, because our heart is always troubled. And along with that, of course, there is definitely the great affliction of fear. I think heaven knows it's all of these things, psychological impulses are a kind of a mixture of different components from different sources, and I'm sure that some of our tendency toward fear is due to the fact that we live in a dangerous world. There is really a lot of stuff to be afraid of. I don't deny that. It's always been that way. It used to be probably saber-toothed tigers, things like that, and now it is other things that are just as dangerous, and it's probably more difficult to run away from than the old causes. So there is a realistic factor in fear, but it is also can be a great problem. And I think some of it is probably due to the admixture of, as we would say in the Gnostic tradition, of archonic elements into our psyche. Why? Because the archons, whoever they are, whatever you want to call them, they like it if we are afraid of them. That's what they live for. They love it that people are afraid of them, and therefore they cultivate, fear in us. And all of this, let's say, causes multiple problems. And so even the Lord himself says, let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. And you can see that he is probably, at least in part, speaking to his disciples on the basis of the fear of death and what comes thereafter. Because he says, look, in my Father's house there are many mansions. So you think that you haven't been very good, you did this and that, and you didn't do other things. There is still a place for you, and it's going to be okay. And if you are afraid that if you go to heaven you have to be with all these fundamentalists, I mean, that's something to be afraid of. Definitely. Then don't be afraid of that either, because they'll be in one place, you'll be in another one. You won't have to bother with them. There are many mansions. And this is actually, it's sort of sustained by various insights. When I was a youngster, much too long ago, unfortunately. You know, I remember my theosophical friends, and so it was all reincarnation, reincarnation, reincarnation. And of course, I wouldn't argue against my elders who knew Annie Besant and who knew Leadbeater, who almost knew Madame Blavatsky. So I said, you know, it's okay, people, but do I really want to come back? But I remained mum about it. And so, you know, that was sort of, there was a big thing for a long time. That is, there just really a very limited number of possibilities. You die, and then you sort of hang around in another world, and then, boom, you come back. And just goes on like that, which is really rather hopeless kind of a prospect. But even, let's say, as we are discovering more and more statements and writings, even from the great Madame Blavatsky, whose anniversary, whose death was celebrated, commemorated this week, you know, we find that she said also, you know, there are all kinds of conditions, there are all kinds of places in the other worlds. And it's not at all certain that people will reincarnate. They can go to these various places and from there to higher places and so forth. And it's a very pluralistic situation. This is in some of her writings that were discovered and never published before, and just been published a few years ago. So I think we need to keep in mind that it's not a cut and dried situation either in, let's say, esoteric terms or in any other terms. Of course, we have the great difficulty with which I think Christendom has been afflicted for a long time, of the notion of eternal hellfire. If you haven't been good, down below, deep down below, there is a place for you to go. And this has been a terrible thing. When you really accept that, then there is an element of profound fear somewhere in your psyche all the time, no matter what you do. But you know, even there things have come forth in comparatively recent times that really change these beliefs considerably, and that is primarily the Divine Mercy movement. There is the icon of the Divine Mercy, Christ, and these are revelations that were given to a Polish nun back in the earlier part of the 20th century. And what they really consist of is promises from the Lord Christ that if we address Him at the time of our death, and certain prayers have been given, but I'm sure that they are not inevitable. It's really the consciousness, address Him, then He, as the words that Saint Maria Faustina Kozłowska recalled from Christ, telling him, I will stand between you and the Father, and you are not going to be punished. Very Gnostic kind of a statement. And it is tremendously prevalent and popular movement in the Roman Catholic Church at the present time. And it's a very commendable development. And so here it is, you know, we shouldn't be afraid. Instead of being afraid, we should address ourselves to the highest and the best, call upon the highest and the best within ourselves. And with that, you know, approach the divine. And if we do, then I think the words of neither be afraid will be heeded. It's very, very important. So if you you want the tingle of fear, go to a horror movie. You know, there used to be some real good ones. I'm sure there are still some. You know, then it's legitimate because it's fantasy. You're a little bit afraid of the monster, this and that. Then you go home and have a cup of coffee and don't worry about it anymore. But don't be afraid. For instance, the great Il Gran Papa, as his successor called him, the great Pope John Paul II, very soon after his election and his installment as Pope, he gave a sermon in Rome that's very famous. And in it, he 14 times, I think he said, don't be afraid, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. And why did he do that? Because he knew something. He knew that when all is said and done, in a really profound sense, there is nothing to be afraid of. After all, you know, we have a connection with the source from whence we came. And that connection is a good one, especially if we cultivate it, if we bring it into consciousness. There is something, somebody, some great unfathomable mystery there, which I know it's a sort of a much abused word, but still there is somebody there who loves us. When that one time came to me with big power, it literally knocked me to the ground. Why is that? Well, because we usually don't consider, unless we are very egotistical people, we don't really consider ourselves terribly lovable. And yet, you know, it exists. And maybe that also ties in with some other connections. There is also the secular holiday of Mother's Day today. You know, it's the sort of thing like a mother's love, when all is as it really ought to be. It's always there. You know, a child might be disobedient, a child might be not terribly lovable sometimes, but the mother's love is still there. And it's a foretaste of that. You know, Jesus says I think it's in Thomas or Philip, he says, my mother gave me life, but my great mother gave me the great life. That's a translation for it. It refers to the celestial mother. So there is a principle there of the life-giving and life-nourishing principle, which really ultimately is divine. And so if we have such forces, such forms of consciousness looking out for us, then really what is there to be afraid of? Now, of course, along come various people, politicians, and who try to make us afraid of various things. Why? Because they, in some manner in their power play, will profit from our fear. So you should be afraid of that, because I am here sitting in Washington or London or wherever I am, and I'm going to help you, and then you won't have to be afraid. It's a self-serving cultivation of fear. That doesn't mean that an intelligent caution in life is to be thrown to the winds. You know, you walk around in the Hollywood Hills, especially certain time of the year, you better have an intelligent caution about little wiggly things that rattle. Sure, because if you get too close to them and really make them afraid of you, then your fear will be justified and they'll bite you. So there are various things that we have to have an intelligent caution of. But on the whole, generally in life and in the afterlife, we should not be afraid. I well remember, being in my anecdotage, as I always say, I well remember around the time when I came to this country in the early 50s, where everybody was afraid of the atom bomb. And people dug kind of little mole holes in their backyards, if they had one, covered it with a thin piece of board, and that's what they were going to hide when the atomic warfare has started. A lot of good it would do them, but you want to do something to allay your fear a little bit. And it's that sort of thing, atomic warfare, this and that, I think, along with metaphysical fears, that Pope John Paul addressed himself to, look, and he was a mystic, great follower of Saint Teresa of Avila and others. He knew things, and he knew that what people were so afraid of, a nuclear war, the Soviets are going to take over the world, and all that. He knew that it's not going to happen. And he tried to assure people, he says, don't be afraid. And so I think we need to keep that in mind about various things. We all have experienced bad things in our lives. They're just differ in kind and maybe sometimes in degree. And yet we're here. Here we are, looking at each other is looking at you. Here we are looking at each other, we're all right. The bad things that happened to us in our lives, and they did not destroy us. We got through them, and we are here, and we are going on with our life, and hopefully with our spiritual life. And we have to trust in that, and trust in the merciful and loving forces which are sent to us from the ultimate source, and regarding which we have been assured by the messengers of light, by the Lord Christ, by Prophet Mani, by others. And the more we align ourselves with that, the more confidence we have, then we will be able not to have our hearts troubled and not to be afraid. I'll recount a little incident occurred to somebody whom I know, and certainly no names shall be named. But there was someone some years ago who was undergoing a pretty serious surgery with general anesthesia and all that sort of thing. And while in that condition, usually when you have anesthesia, you don't remember anything afterwards. But this one remembered. It was in a very, very dicey, very dark kind of a place. And various thoughts came up, maybe this is a sort of hell. Maybe that's what's going on. Maybe that's where I'm going. And wasn't obviously not a very nice feeling. And then there came a voice. It said, "There is no place where I am not." That brought that person out of it. After all, people have believed for centuries and centuries in the omnipresence of God, didn't they? But still, they were afraid of this, that, and the other things. So that's also a thing to remember, that conditions may be sometimes off-putting and scary, but there is no place where the divine presence does not obtain. and therefore we can address it, and it will help us. This, I think, is a very wonderful thing, but like so many wonderful things, we have to remind ourselves, because we are a forgetful lot. We learn the truth, and instead of letting the truth make us free, we forget the truth, and then we are in trouble again. So when we hear these words from the Gospel of John, let's continue to remember that. President Roosevelt has been noted for a particular, well, for many things, of course, particular phrase which I'm sure was written by one of his speechwriters, and what else. They said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And that's a pretty good saying. Whoever came up with that was no fool, because when we experience the fear, that messes us up. So fear itself is something to get away from and to be shunned. In so doing, I think we come closer and closer to the goal. No doubt we experience difficulties, no doubt we experience setbacks and deprivations and so forth. That's how earthly life is. But ultimately, when the onion is peeled, when you take all the layers of the onion, of course, in reality, then in the middle you find nothing. That's what the Buddhists call a void, probably. This could be a new sutra, the Onion Sutra. So, you might tell it to the lamas, they'll come up with one. But, when all the layers are peeled away, there's really nothing to be afraid of. At the heart of it all, there is something good. There is something loving. There is something kind. There is something wise. There is something that is helpful. We have to do some things in order to get in touch with it and to remain in touch with it. But then we will have followed the words, the admonition, "Let not your heart be troubled, and neither let it be afraid." So maybe we might think about this at this time, because in every period of history, and maybe in our one at least as much as in others, there are all kinds of inducements to fear, all kinds of inducements to being troubled, and we have the ability and even the command to get away from those things and to come to something better. And so may the mystery of that which hangs, fish, heaven and earth descend upon us and remain with us always. Amen.